Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining today for Framing Mindsets and Movements from Big Ideas to Practical Know-How. My name is Jose Vasquez, pronouns they, them, and I'm the communication strategist at Philanthropy Together. Closed captioning is available for today's session and can be enabled at the bottom of your Zoom screen by clicking the three buttons labeled More and then clicking the option labeled CC. We'll drop the instructions in the chat. A bit again about Philanthropy Together. We're a global initiative looking to grow, connect, and strengthen the field of collective and collaborative giving with programming like We Give Summit, where you are right now. Through today's session, please engage with us in the chat. We love seeing y'all talk and be mindful of our We Give Summit community guidelines. And then stay with us until the end of the session when we'll announce someone here who is going to be very lucky in the Zoom room to receive a choice of a gift. That'll include a book, a card deck, or a training for nonprofit leaders. This year's We Give Summit centers on community-based organizations, civil society organizations, and how all of us can give together to best support them. In today's session, we're going to tap into tested ways of inviting broader participation in the greatest social movement of our time. With that, I'm very excited to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Julie Sweetland from the Frameworks Institute. Welcome, Julie. Give a hand, everybody. Yay.
Hey, thank you so much, Jose, for that warm introduction, and thanks to all of you for making some time for this session, as well as thank you for the amazing work you are doing in collective giving and philanthropy. I'm delighted to have a chance to talk with you all about framing mindsets and movements because I am quite confident that these concepts and can help you move your missions with greater power and pace. In general, we cannot achieve our missions as change makers, as mission-driven folks, without powerful communication, whether that's internally to our teams, to our closest stakeholders, or in changing broader understandings and mindsets around the issues that we are working on. And so, Frameworks, as a nonprofit, our mission is to help folks like you achieve your mission through the power of framing. We work with storytellers, advocates, organizations, foundations to frame the public discourse and build public will for progressive social change. And we do that through conducting original social science research. Most of us are social scientists. I happen to be a linguist. We have anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, et cetera, on staff. And we really use those disciplinary perspectives to study the cultural and communications aspects of different social and scientific issues. And then we're also a group of social change strategists. And so share that research and walk alongside partners as they seek to apply empirical insights into powerful ways to frame their issues as they continue to do their work. So we live to our nonprofit mission by making that research freely available to the nonprofit sector. If you haven't fallen down the rabbit hole that is our website, I invite you to do so soon. But today you're getting a guided tour of some of the greatest hits. So this is work, on some of the important movements of our moment. For instance, our longstanding work with the Harvard Center on the Developing Child has helped move the early childhood field from a vulnerability frame, focusing on children as vulnerable, as potential victims, that sort of thing, to a broader brain development frame. And that has let that movement reorient funding, expand programs, and boost outcomes. We're working with community-led neighborhood revitalization efforts across the United States, but particularly in the urban South, telling different types of stories, moving from a story that's about poverty as a predicament towards one that's more about how we can create prosperity through policy. And that is shifting, right? The way those cities, those neighborhoods are approaching reinvestment in underinvested and disinvested neighborhoods. And then I'll say a little bit today is because about tobacco at a couple different times, the tobacco movement, because it's a great example of what reframing can do. Right now, that sector is moving from a story about tobacco-related harms as a preventable health problem or just another health problem to something that's much more of a social justice lens and talking about the unjust conditions that concentrate those harms in certain places and in certain groups. So those are just some examples of how organizations right now, day to day, are reframing their issues and how much it can do to change the context you're working in. So when I say framing, what I mean simply is making choices and how we present our ideas. And when we can see that those choices have an effect, right? They have a frame effect when they shift how people think, feel, or act in response to our ideas. So, as an example from our work on early childhood, we know that different choices have different frame effects. When we ran a national survey experiment looking to boost policy for sound early childhood policy, we tested two different ways of talking about the issue that we need to attend to early childhood issues because it's a vulnerable period of life full of risks, or we can talk about early childhood matters because children are full of tremendous promise and are the basis of our shared prosperity, civically, economically, and socially. And when we tested those frames, we see that it can create a wide difference in the extent to which people support that issue. So a more positive, forward-looking prosperity frame boosted that policy support by 8% relative to a control that got no message. And the vulnerability frame reduced that support. Our interpretation of this is that people hear vulnerable children and they think bad parents. And that's, of course, not the frame we want on the issue, but people look around for someone to blame and don't see it as a policy issue necessarily or a structural issue. So, but overall, just having understanding that these choices can have real significant effects on to the extent which people align with our causes. So over time, framing can catalyze sustainable social change. So when we as social sector communicators change what we say and we change our communication, that changes the public discourse. It shapes what people hear. And that really matters because one of the strongest predictors of what people will think is the number of times they have heard it. And so if we are out there in public discourse, explaining our issues, connecting our issues to shared values, it really can shape public thinking on issues. And that matters because the extent to which the public understands an issue and demands certain sorts of changes has an effect on how our institutions respond, whether that's big P policy in terms of legislation or little p policy, which I like to define as any decisions that people in a group decide any decision to act or not to act. So that can be, in a very small group as well. And so when we set up the conditions, right, for those policies to respond to public thinking, to what people want, what they understand, that leaves that institution, right, in a place where if we get a new leader, we don't get a whole new policy. We have to start from scratch, right? We've built the support for the kinds of changes we want to see. All right, so that's what I think a little bit about framing as at a high level. I just want to get a temperature check in the room and get a sense of how familiar are you with strategic framing as part of your issue communications. And we won't reveal the results of this poll right away. We'll do it in a few minutes down the road. But I just want to invite everyone to answer to this. And also invite you to introduce yourself in the chat if you haven't done so already and reinforce what Jose said, which is, we encourage you to use the chat, drop in a question as we go through. I'll have a few different spots where we'll pause to take questions and listen to the room. But yeah, if you could just fill out the poll for now, and then the producer can pull the poll down whenever there are a good number of responses, and we'll review the responses a little bit later. And maybe just give me a signal when I should move on. Well, I'll go ahead and move on. But yeah, it's just great. And we'll look at those responses a little bit later. What we're going to do in the next half an hour or so, 35 minutes before we're going to start to wind down, is explore these ideas. Mindsets matter a lot, and to many of us. Framing can move mindsets, and I'll go through two big reframing moves that will help you amplify your impact. And throughout, I just hope to make the point and reinforce that the framing choices we make are can be both about our own values, our own movements, or coalitions, principles, and what we want to get across. And there's an empirical side of it, right? Understanding that the way we position the ideas that we hold dear really affect, right, how many people align with them and the knowledge, attitudes, and policy preferences that people walk away with. So, the first core concept is that mindsets matter. I'm going to show the reason they matter. One way of understanding why they matter comes from this diagram from our friends at FSG, a social change consultancy. And they talk about if you're trying to change a system, there are different, you could think about this as a dashboard where you can kind of push on these different buttons, right? And to change the settings of the system. And the most obvious buttons that you could push on are the policies, the practices, and the resource flows, right? Where's the money, the people, et cetera. And those are often the parts of the systems that we see the most. There's also, it's pretty clear once you are, working within a system that the relationships, the connections, and the power dynamics are always at play. And those are important if you're trying to change a system as well. But at a fundamental level, and often below what we can notice, are the mental models that people are using to understand that issue and work in that system. They're basically the mental machinery that holds the whole system up, the ways of understanding something that make it make sense to people within that system. So, as one example, we can think about how Americans hold a dominant mental model or mindset, and I'll use those two terms interchangeably today, um, of consumerism. The idea that we get what we need through commercial transactions. I get goods and services by buying and selling. And that mental model, right, can hold up a system of getting my coffee, right, perfectly fine. But if we try to apply that mental model, that foundational mental model to things like the things that are common good, clean air, right, good health care, social participation, and belonging, right? Then that consumerist mindset really starts to send us in some directions that aren't in line with justice, equity, and good sound policy. So to think about the mental models that are holding up a system and where they may be models that aren't productive, right, for our purposes. And when we see the mental models or the mindsets aren't right driving the type of system we want, we can shift those mindsets. That can change the policies, the conditions around us, and those policies can shift mindsets as well. So we can start to reframe tobacco as something dangerous, and then that right? Shifts the fact that we don't have smoking on airplanes or in restaurants anymore. And that policy change changes the way people think, right? And oh wow, secondhand smoke is dangerous. Wow, we should think about that. And so on and so forth. You can get a virtuous circle here. So mindset shifts can be a high leverage place for your groups to focus on. And yes, I just see a note in here from Buddy Rose. One mental model is pull oneself up by the bootstraps when people don't have the boots to start out with. That's exactly where I was headed was what are some of the mental models that we can find again and again across issues. I'm going to go through some fundamental mental models that we've documented in our research at Frameworks. And I just want to encourage people to react as I go in the chat. Do you recognize that mindset in your context? How does that show up on the issue you work on? Or I know we've got an international group and folks from all over the country and all working in all different sorts of things. If it doesn't show up, if it's unfamiliar or different, I want to hear that too. Tell us what you notice. And as I get to the end of this section, we'll stop and see what people have said and lift some of that up. All right. So as I go through the mindsets, feel free to react. How does that work in your context, or how does it not? As we document through interviews and coding large sets of data where people are thinking and talking about lots of different issues, we see on issues all over the place: early childhood, climate change, housing, mental health, criminal justice, justice reform, those sorts of things. We see these same mindsets showing up again and again in ways that work against a more just and inclusive society. So the fundamental, foundational mindset in American culture, at least, is individualism. The idea that outcomes are purely or primarily, right, the effect, the function of people's effort, willpower, and choices, and that the benefits or consequences of those choices also are at the individual level, right? So if I make poor health choices and I'm sick, that's sad for me and mine, but it's not a broader social issue, right? So both the causes and the effects live at the level of individual. Otherism, this is a us versus them type of mindset, that there are different groups in society, and some are doing the they're doing the individualism right, they're making all the right choices, and others are failing in those choices, those values, those behaviors, and that's the problem, right, with the social. That's the cause of the social issue. There are other versions of otherism. I'm not going to linger on otherism too much today, but just wanted to point out that it's definitely a foundational model that affects lots of issues. And finally, fatalism. This is the sense that our problems are too big to fix. There's not a lot we can do, whether that's because we believe the system is so ingrained in society, there's no way to root it out, whether it's because we think, oh, there's no way to fix those people, whatever it may be. It's a sense of being stuck, right? Kind of with what we've got. So curious to hear if these sound familiar to you, or unfamiliar if you're in a place where they don't quite show. I'm going to show a video of a couple of these that bring these to life, and these are data taken from, these are clips from interviews taken across the country over the last few years, to just show that the same idea shows up in lots of different places, lots of different people again and again. That's one of the characteristics of a mental model or mindset. So this is a video edited to show how people express this underlying mental model of individualism.
Tell me what you think about how we can prevent social problems.
It's up to each individual in themselves to really dictate where their lives are going to go.
Well, the person has to be willing first to change themselves.
You can't do everything for everybody.
Then you got to believe in yourself.
It's the mind and the determination on what they want to do and whether or not they go forward.
Well, I think people have to want to help themselves first.
It still takes that individual person to want it for themselves.
Ultimately, how we pick ourselves up, and live our days is a choice in our hand.
I think some people make their lives more difficult by the decisions that they make.
I just think it's all choices. I mean, really and truly, I just think it's a choice.
So curious to hear if that sounds familiar to you on the issue that you work on. But we can see that people are locating all kinds of issues in the choices of individuals. And of course, the choices we make matter. We all have agency, and and I don't mean to suggest that our individual choices don't matter. But when people are reasoning from that mental model, what social context and upstream factors, right, what's around us, right, falls out of view. All right. Similarly, we see this mental model of fatalism being very pervasive, and similarly, it's just a reel that shows this coming up again and again in interviews across the country with lots of different people.
What do you think we can do about that?
It's a good question.
I don't think anything's ever going to change.
Poverty is always going to exist, and I think it's just going to get worse and worse.
And once the damage is done, I don't really see it how they could really fix it.
Poverty is something which is inherent to human nature. Rent's going to be expensive no matter what. There's always been people complaining of the price.
I think you can never stop crying.
What do you think about the government?
Is there one?
It's pretty pathetic.
I feel pretty helpless. I think there's a lot we don't know.
I've never voted a day in my life.
I don't feel like we really make a difference right now.
Government in America right now is broken.
There's two things we have to do, is pay taxes and die.
It doesn't matter how much time or how much money you throw at something, it's still going to be the same.
I think to a point, if you have screwed up parents, you're going to have screwed up kids. I don't know if anything can be done. But wait for the next generation.
People don't realize in a billion years, the sun's eventually going to consume us, and it's going to be the end.
That's a fun note to end it on. Eventually, the sun will consume us, and that will be the end. So I like this reel in particular because it shows, you may have been able to tell that some of that video goes back to the 90s. And so while we are in an exceptionally fatalistic moment right now, that fundamental mental model has been with us for a moment. I just wanted to ask if anybody, and we don't have too big of a group here, I think. So if somebody would prefer to unmute and share out loud, if you can raise your hand and wait to be acknowledged if you'd prefer to just speak into the room, but you can put in the chat, how do these two mental models, individualism and fatalism, affect the issues that you work on? How do they show up? How do they block your progress? Take a moment to reflect on that. Put it in the chat, or we can let folks unmute. I'm going to try to find my way into the spot where I can see people raise their hand. All right, so seeing that people feel a lack of agency takes us out of the equation, right? People just decide not to get involved, right? If it's such a big problem, why would I spend my time working on it? The individualism mindset shapes gun violence prevention. Good point, Heidi. Leads to a lot of victim blaming. I think you'll notice when I start to talk about episodic stories in a moment that you'll find a lot of resonance there. Keeps folks from collaborating. Buddy Rose talked about mental health. If it's an individual matter, if it's just your genes, just your brain chemistry, or whatever people may say, right? It's not rooted in community. It's not about what shapes us. And yeah, it keeps us from thinking about how to tackle the system of as a whole. These mental models affect us all. I've just offered a couple of ideas here. I think that the main point I want to offer here is that these foundational mental models, they really cut across our social issues, right? So on early childhood, it all comes down to parents. On economic justice, right? The solution is work hard to get ahead. On housing, we've heard people say, the reason we have residential segregation in the United States is because people want to live near people who look like them, right? So even individualizing that, one of the most structural choices we've made as a society. On climate, right? Let's make the solutions individual. People just need to sacrifice, drive less, walk more. And again, it's not that parents, hard work, personal choice, or personal behaviors don't have a role in these issues. It's that when people are hyper focused on these other things are obscured. On fatalism, same way. We can't save those kids, can't change the system, can't affect the housing market, can't defeat, the big bad corporate interest. And that has people turn away from the issue rather than mobilize. So one thing we can do is recognize across our coalitions, across our movements, across our discrete issues, so we're all up against these same unproductive mindsets. And if we are taking steps in our own sphere of influence to counter these, right, we are at the same time lifting up, right, other issues at the same time. We're not competing, we're coordinating, even if loosely and far apart. That's all I'm going to say about mindsets for the moment. I just wanted to see, again, we can encourage people to go back into the chat and see what people have said. Um, Democracy, a real fatalism issue. That is so true, Lauren. We've got a lot of great resources on that and a monthly briefing slash conversation at Frameworks each month on democracy issues in particular, and coming together around ways to counter fatalism and basic misunderstanding of democracy. Some people talking about how these mental models can make it, you need time to establish trust before engaging across functions or cultures. And so lots of resonance here of how these things affect your work. All right, so now I would love to reveal if do we get poll answers? If so, this is a good moment to change them or to show them. Okay, so we've got folks that are kind of okay. So a nice little bell curve here, I think, about just 10%-ish, 10 to 15% on either end, right, of the highly familiar or not at all, and then most of us in the middle. And that is great because we're going to get into how framing can work on these mindsets. And so lots of us can have insights to add to the chat, and I hopefully we'll be able to all learn together. So here, the core concept is that the way we frame our issues shapes these mindsets. We can see that happening in real time, but I think it's most, it gives me the most hope when I see that over a longer span of history. So for a long time, the mindsets, right, around commercial tobacco is that they were a healthful product, right? Doctors recommending them to women in pregnancy to calm nausea, or saying, hey, before you go on a race, like instead of overeating, smoke instead, and that will keep you healthy. So with those kinds of messages coming at people, right, people thought of tobacco as a guilty pleasure, but did not think of it as something dangerous or something that needed to be regulated. As advocates conscientiously shifted the frame, the definition of tobacco from a guilty pleasure to a defective product, we got different sorts of messages and we got different sorts of understandings, right? So, really positioning the cigarettes and other forms of commercial tobacco as something that's quite dangerous, attributing responsibility to the companies. You notice the little Marlboro wedge there. And just really firmly through imagery, connecting the idea of tobacco to, right, it being a dangerous and deadly product. And that had a major effect on social norms and on policies. The role of government became, not just to leave people alone, but to step in and offer protections, particularly around youth and those sorts of things. Fast forward, right, another 40, 50 years, and we see that change. Those overall policies really did bring down rates of smoking and related harms on average, but did not always reach groups that were marginalized due to race, to class, to mental health status, income status, geography, etc. And so now we see the movement working intentionally to point out the places where the protections that most of us can take for granted aren't covering, right? So most of us can take for granted now that our workplace is smoke free. We don't have to go to work and be exposed to dangerous chemicals. But if you work in a casino, or rather, if you work on the floor of a casino, odds are, right, that your workplace is not smoke free. Although the big bosses up on the top floor, their office is likely protected. If you know, and then there is a continuing, right, targeted industry targeting of particular groups, LGBTQ plus, people of color, people in rural areas, and so forth, right? So here there's a reframing of this from just not just a dangerous issue, but an issue of discrimination, an issue of inequity. And so with that kind of that we can see that those mindsets and those policies shifting in real time. And it's a source of hope for me. You can see the broad span of what this can do over decades. There are lots of other great examples of how advocates have reframed social issues over time. In real time, there are specific things that we can do. We can make different moves. We can make different choices when we are writing our annual reports, selecting the stories that go on our social media feed. Engaging new donors or inviting people into our movement. So these types of choices are the things that we study at frameworks and try to guide folks toward things that we know can work. So to counter that individualism mental model, we can shift people to a mental model that's something around um, what surrounds us shapes us, a context matters mental model. And we see this existing in public culture. It's just not as strong, it's not as reinforced, it doesn't get as many reps as the individualism mental model. And so, what we can do in our communications is remind people that they know this, show them sticky examples, help fill in this lightly sketched mental model for folks. One thing we can do is to think about the types of stories we tell. So often, I think, particularly when we're asking for folks to give donations, it's natural and easy to tell an episodic story, a portrait story that talks about an individual who has a personal trouble, finds some motivation, finds some help, and that problem is solved. We find again and again that type of story, while it's easy to tell and people actually do like to hear them, generally the takeaway from that is to fix the people in the story, or blame the people in the story on issues of gun violence. We see this again and again, right? The sympathetic character, the person was a father, a mother, a brother, and through no fault of their own, right, ended up in this violent situation. And we want to know what motivated the shooter, and either punish that person, or grieve with the family. And while those things are true, and we want to, of course, extend empathy to anyone who's experienced violence or lost a loved one, that type of story leaves out the community conditions, the gun laws, any of those sorts of things, right, that even let that story be possible. So one thing we can do is ensure that we're telling not painting portraits, but painting panoramas. We're telling more thematic stories, that we're putting our stories in, rooting them in community and social conditions. We're telling the stories of groups, not just isolated individuals. The plot of the story isn't people overcoming a personal trouble, but a group solving a shared problem. And the plot, right, is moving towards those shared goals, and the solution is changing the conditions. So we can shift the kinds of stories we tell about the people we are working with, for, and on behalf of. And here is, well, and that matters as we can see that the change in story changes people's willingness to support good equity focused policies. I could show you this on lots of different issues, but here's one on the issue of oral health when we talked about an individual person who couldn't get good care versus a broader story. And I'll show you an example of those in just a minute. We see real differences, right, in what people will support. So the portrait structure statistically was the same as saying nothing. The panorama or the thematic story structure moved people towards those policies. You can get like that's a 10 point, I guess it's a 9 point swing on this one, and it makes, really makes a meaningful difference. All right, so people often say, how do you tell those stories? What do those look like? Often it's just telling the story of a person, but putting them in context. And so here's an example from our partners at the National Center on Elder Abuse that takes a story that could be all about sympathy for, a lonely older person, but puts it in, again, a wider context. And I'll just invite you to notice what shifts from the individualism to the context matters, what shifts from the episodic to thematic. As you notice things that make it go broader, make it go panorama, I invite you to comment in the chat. All right, here we go. This is maybe, I think this is a 60-second spot.
A just society works to make sure everyone is free from the threat of abuse at every stage of life. To live up to our ideal of justice for all, we need to work to address the social issue of elder abuse. It's important to understand what creates the risk of experiencing abuse or neglect as we age. A strong and just society is like a structure, supported by many beams. We need strong beams that are frequently maintained. You can think of these beams as the policies and programs that reinforce the relationships and resources needed for health, happiness, and safety. When those support beams are missing or not maintained, the structure is weaker and may not meet our expectations that people are able to live free from maltreatment. The first and most important step to prevent elder abuse is to reduce social isolation. George, age 77, reminds us why this is important. George spends most of his time at home alone since his wife died. His daughter lives too far away to visit regularly, and his neighborhood lacks reliable public transit and many age-friendly civic spaces. Fewer social interactions mean fewer opportunities for walking, talking, and laughing. And with these normal, healthy experiences missing, George's physical, cognitive, and emotional health have gotten worse. His daughter does not know what she can do or where she can turn for help. Without the structure of support, it's easy to see how if George encountered an unsafe situation, the problem might go unnoticed. George's story of social isolation is not uncommon. With millions of our fellow Americans living in similar situations, it's fair to say that our nation's social structure needs repair. Just as one beam alone can't support a building, individuals and family members alone can't single-handedly manage the problem of social isolation and the corresponding risk of maltreatment. The good news is that there are many ways to strengthen our social supports through policies, services, and programs that keep us integrated in our communities as we age. We can design and equip community centers to work as intergenerational spaces that allow older people to build relationships and participate in the work, play, and life of our neighborhoods. We can think about the role of transportation and reducing social isolation and adjust systems so that we can all continue to move throughout our communities as we age. We can figure out new and better ways to arrange and coordinate the teams, agencies, and programs that specifically work with older people. We can develop programs to educate families and professionals who work with older adults to understand the importance of preventing isolation, how to spot the warning signs of maltreatment, and what to do to address abuse or neglect. By doing all we can to strengthen the social support structure, we can reduce social isolation, protect communities and families against elder abuse, and build a nation that lives up to our promise of justice for all. Learn more and see how you can get involved in preventing elder abuse and promoting greater justice for older people at ncea.acl.gov.
Okay, So I'm curious. I don't want to. It's always risky to put out an example because people want to. No example is perfect. But I'm curious what you noticed, if anything, about what moves that story of George from a portrait to a panorama. What are some framing moves you could lift from that example? So some of the things I noticed was talking about it in terms of just saying, right, this family is not alone, right? This happens to lots of people. That is one move that story made. The second is to talk about the causal mechanisms, right? Okay, good. You all are coming up with answers. All right, I won't talk then. All right, so Buddy points out that really using that metaphor of infrastructure applies to everyone. We all experience it. So that is putting it, right? Yeah, that metaphor, right, moves it into a structural thing. Um, uh, Alex points out how they're positioning, right, the issue. So it's not just aging as a whole, right? It's elder mistreatment, and that really teaches us a lot about abuse or mistreatment as a whole, not just for this issue. Um, Notice that they haven't talked about someone who's already been a victim, someone who could be, and so people, right, that opens up the door for people to connect. That's really astute, Heidi. I also really like the point where they don't show a hyper emotional experience of abuse. They show the danger sign on the TV, right? So it's pointing out that it's a real issue, but it's not kind of sending people into hyper empathy mode or sympathy mode, which allows them to think more structurally. And then finally, Jessica points out that the solutions, right, are community level, transit, community centers, healthcare systems that involve, right, people who are affected. So great analysis there. Thanks for saving me the trouble of doing it. So any of those ideas are ways to reframe again from individualism to context matters. I like this quote from C. Wright Mills, an influential sociologist, where he talks about troubles occurring within the character of the individual. They have to do with oneself and those limited areas of social life in which you're directly and personally aware, or issues that have to do with matters that transcend these local environments. An issue is a public matter. Some value cherished by the public is felt to be threatened. And that's another thing that story did, was it really set it in the value of justice, right? We're going to live up to our value of justice for all. That sort of thing can really help to widen the lens on the issue. All right, the second, oh, right, here we go. So if you could just take a moment, think about a topic that you work on through collective giving. How could it be framed as a personal trouble, and how do you reframe it? You probably already do this. How do you reframe it as an issue or a shared social concern? And if anyone wants to come off mute, that would be just fine. I think we'd prefer to participate that way. All right. I'll move on, and then I bet we'll get some answers in a moment. The second thing we can work on is to reframe move people from away from the mental model of fatalism and toward a more can-do type of social model, right? We designed this system so we can redesign it to do what we want. One thing we can do is to move away from crisis framing, really working on the logic that if people only knew how bad it was, right, they would be shocked or shamed into action. As it turns out, that's actually not how public thinking works. The public has a finite pool of worry, as one sociologist put it, and every time we kind of hit the crisis framing, we're draining that pool. Instead, we find that maybe counterintuitively, telling people we can solve a problem makes them want to solve the problem, whereas just telling them how bad the problem is likely to lead to apathy or overwhelm. So, the when we come together, we can figure it out. We are resourceful. We are, um, when we fight together, we win. Any of those kinds of more efficacious framing strategies can really make a difference. And Jose, I couldn't agree more. Crisis framing doesn't give people a way to see the solution. It just prompts them to react negatively, and often just wanting to find somebody else to solve the problem. And we see that right now in our ongoing study of American culture and how culture is changing over time. We see that Americans are in a pretty fatalistic space. They're deeply dissatisfied with the state of our country, but they aren't necessarily sure what change should look like. Ooh, did I do something? Okay, hang on, sorry. Okay. And we see people agreeing with statements, large majorities agreeing with statements like our country should be radically restructured or our society needs to be remade in major ways. But when we ask them how, it goes quiet. We ask people to imagine a positive future for the United States in 2050. People really struggle. And when they do start to talk about things, the thread in their answers is really someone or something has to come in and save us. And so that leaves us vulnerable in lots of ways. And one thing we can do is help people see that a better future is within reach. So emphasizing framing with solutions. So ensuring you're not just telling people about the problems, but talking about the end state, the positive vision, leading with your aspirations, right? Not just the problems. And a study on how to talk about health equity in rural areas in the United States, we found that once we started getting people to focus on a positive future, that really countered and dissipated a lot of the us versus them blaming that we had. We were seeing otherwise. And when we tested it quantitatively, we saw that showing, like painting that beautiful future, really helped people have a sense that we actually could make a difference on even long-standing and deep problems like racial inequities and economic disparities. And so to convince Americans, right, that no, we actually can improve, effects of racism by 10% over control. That just shows you how powerful how hungry people are for some kind of positive direction. So including our solutions and talking about them in positive ways is an important framing move at all times, but I think especially at this moment. And so instead of giving Chicken Little the keys to our social media feed, right, we can instead give more efficacious kinds of framing. So on the left, this is typical things we're hearing right now. America, states are bracing for billions of dollars in cuts to Medicaid, which would end healthcare for millions of adults and children. Medicaid cuts will leave the poorest and most vulnerable Americans without access to life-saving medical care. Nursing homes will close. Children with complex medical needs will be cut off from care and die. And all for what? Tax cuts for the rich. I don't disagree with anything there, right? This is all true, but it doesn't mean it's our most effective way to mobilize people to care and to act. And so a more explanatory approach, counterintuitively, actually has more of an effect. So Medicaid, let's just take back up, understanding that, for instance, people think this, there's a predictable pushback of this being a handout. Medicaid is the way we offer public health insurance when people can't get private insurance through an employer. And this is one way that we came together to give more Americans access to health care. 8 in 10 people enrolled in it rate it highly, and there's always room to improve it, but we can't improve a system that doesn't exist. We need to protect Medicaid. You could, and again, improve this more, put this in your own voice, but it explains what it is. It gives people a way to talk about it, not just to react. And then it also pings this idea of collective action, right? This is an example of something we built together. And we see that messages of collective action are really important right now and highly effective. And so just again, trying to balance your emotion with that sense of what we can do. You don't want all urgency. You want some urgency and some efficacy, right? It's a problem and we can do something about it. We can come together to work on it. All right, so what I hope to share today is that foundational mindsets like individualism and fatalism affect all of our issues. When we work to shift mindsets, we can move our mission with greater power and pace. And there are two things we can do. We can widen the lens on our stories and we can offer solutions, build those into our communications. Those were just two examples because we just had a bit of time today. Framing is complex and it's often counterintuitive. There's a lot more to learn. And so I want to encourage you to just stay connected. There are other organizations in this space that do great work. Berkeley Media Studies Group is one that comes to mind. Reframe is another that comes to mind. But also just know that on our website, we live to our nonprofit mission by making this research and resources freely available. So please take advantage of the gifts to the field that others have made. We have regular newsletters, and you can find us on social media. I think Jose put in some of our YouTube things in the chat that just kind of go through these things. I'm going to turn it over to Jose, but not before I offer this quote that just helps me remember the power of framing, that the world changes according to the way people see it. And if you can alter even by a millimeter the way people look at reality, then you can change the world. Each framing shift we make changes that world by a millimeter. And if we're all making the same kinds of changes, we'll really get a lot further faster. Thank you so much for the opportunity and for your time today. Jose, thank you. I'll hand it
Oh,
over to
give a big
you.
hand to Dr. Julie Sweetland. Amazing. Thank you so much. Um, we appreciate all of your valuable insights and helping us paint a picture we can see. Before we wrap up, please answer a quick poll about what you thought about this session, which should have just popped up in your screen. And in the next few days, you can find a recording of today's session on your agenda. And keep this discussion going on the topic about communications and reframing on the Hoover Community Board. Alrighty, my last announcement. The winner of today's raffle for this session is Jed Rich. Jed, congrats. Please check the chat from our event lead, Ava, who can offer you a link to claim your gift. Congratulations, Jed. And please stay around for our next session that'll happen in 8 minutes called Rethinking Pitching and How Nonprofits and Donors Connect. Thank you all so much. And thank you again, Julie, for speaking with us today. Have a wonderful day, everyone.